Before Hollywood figured out how to make blockbusters safe for the whole family, there was Grindhouse. These were films that didn't whisper, they screamed, clawed, and spat in the face of censors. They were violent, shocking, and sometimes downright absurd, but they carried an energy you couldn't find anywhere else. So, what happens when filmmakers stop caring about rules and start caring only about shock value? Buckle in, because we're about to grind through stories that made critics furious and audiences cheer. Blood Feast 1963. If one movie deserves the title of being the first to make the censors panic, it's Blood Feast. Directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis, this film has gone down in history as the godfather of gore. Made for a shoestring budget of around $24,000, Lewis didn't have the money for stars, elaborate sets, or even a tight script. What he did have was a plan. Show things on screen that no one else dared to show. The film follows an Egyptian caterer who lures women to their doom, harvesting their body parts for an ancient ritual. But let's be real, nobody was there for the plot. Audiences came for the blood, and Lewis delivered in buckets. Tongue removals, dismemberments, entrails. This was cinema that went straight for the jugular. The blood was bright red paint. The effects were crude, and the acting was stiff. Yet, it worked because nobody had ever dared to push things this far before. The result? Outrage. Critics dismissed it as trash. Theaters in conservative towns banned it, and even drive-ins debated whether to screen it. But Lewis had found the formula that would shape exploitation cinema. If the movie shocks, the audience flocks. Blood Feast didn't just open the gore floodgates. It made Herschel Gordon Lewis a legend in the underground. It proved you didn't need Hollywood approval, you just needed guts, literally and figuratively. Faster, Pussycat, kill, kill, 1965. Russ Meyer knew how to cause a stir, but with Faster, Pussycat, kill, kill, he created a time bomb of Grindhouse rebellion. The premise alone was enough to rattle censors. 3 go-go dancers hit the desert in fast cars, swinging fists and taking down anyone foolish enough to cross them. It wasn't just the violence, it was who was doing the violence: women. At a time when Hollywood liked its heroines quiet and polite, Meyer gave us Tura Satana as Varla, a leather-clad leader with eyes that burned through the screen. She doesn't just outdrive men. She breaks them, manipulates them, and crushes them with her fists if needed. The film was released in 1965, but watching it today, it still feels dangerous. Critics at the time were horrified, calling it filth, while Grindhouse audiences couldn't get enough. For once, women weren't passive victims, they were the predators. Satana herself, who had trained in martial arts, did her own stunts and gave the film its unforgettable edge. One punch from her looked more real than anything. Hollywood was producing in polished action flicks. Meyer shot it fast and cheap, using stark desert landscapes that added to its rawness. The editing was quick, the dialogue sharp, and the pacing relentless. Faster, Pussycat wasn't a hit in its day, but it found new life later, influencing everyone from Quentin Tarantino to music video directors. It's the kind of movie that snarls at you, dares you to look away, and then laughs when you can't. Grindhouse cinema rarely got more unapologetic than this. I Drink Your Blood, 1970. If Blood Feast opened the gore door, I Drink Your Blood kicked it off its hinges. This 1970 film blended Grindhouse insanity with a storyline so bizarre, it sounds like it was dreamed up during a fever. A group of satanic hippies wreaks havoc on a small town until a boy injects rabies into meat pies and feeds them to the gang. What follows is chaos. Rabid maniacs running wild with foam at their mouths and machetes in their hands. Directed by David E. Durston, the movie was promoted as the first film rated X for violence. The marketing was pure Grindhouse brilliance. Theaters would pass out barf bags as props, daring viewers to stomach the film's gore. Audiences lined up, half out of curiosity, half out of morbid fascination. The movie's violence wasn't polished. It was sweaty, raw, and unrelenting. Throats slashed, bodies hacked, and blood splattered across the screen. The low-budget effects only made it more disturbing. Unlike Hollywood horror, which still tiptoed around on-screen violence in 1970, this one shoved it right in your face. Censors tried to cut it down, but even in hacked versions, it remained one of the most infamous exploitation films of its era. Drive-ins adored it because it delivered the goods: cheap thrills, shocking kills, and a storyline wild enough to get people talking. Critics hated it, but they were never the audience anyway. This was a movie made for the Grindhouse faithful, who left theaters telling their friends they had just survived the cinematic equivalent of rabies itself. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. Few Grindhouse films caused more fury than I Spit on Your Grave. Released in 1978, it tells the story of Jennifer Hills, a writer who retreats to the countryside to finish her book, only to be brutalized by locals. But this isn't where the film ends. It's where it begins. Jennifer fights back one by one with cold-blooded vengeance that leaves no question about who is in charge by the final reel. Directed by Mayor Zarki, the film became one of the most controversial Grindhouse releases ever. Censors loathed it. Critics branded it worthless, and Roger Ebert famously called it a vile bag of garbage. Yet audiences still found it. Why? Because it crossed lines that Hollywood wouldn't dare touch. It didn't flinch from showing brutality, but it also refused to let its heroine stay a victim. The revenge sequences are slow, methodical, and brutal in their own right. Jennifer doesn't just lash out, she plans, waits, and makes sure her tormentors suffer. That sense of empowerment, though wrapped in exploitation trappings, resonated with many Grindhouse fans. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't polished, but it was raw and unforgettable. The controversy made the film legendary. Some theaters refused to screen it, others slapped on warning posters, and audiences lined up anyway. Whether you love it or hate it, I Spit on Your Grave remains a symbol of Grindhouse's shove-it attitude towards censorship. It dared to go places polite cinema wouldn't, and that audacity cemented its place in history. Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, 1975. When it comes to films that taunted the censors, Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, sits in a category of its own. Released in 1975, this Canadian-shot, American-produced film told the story of Ilsa, a sadistic camp commandant who uses her power for cruel experiments. The concept alone was enough to spark outrage, and once word spread, protests and bans quickly followed. Starring Diane Thorne in the title role, the movie leaned into excess with no apologies. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't tasteful, and that was exactly the point. The tagline promised, "the most dreaded she-wolf of them all," and Grindhouse audiences showed up in droves. Censors tried to shut it down, declaring it obscene. But theaters knew controversy sells tickets. The production itself was as scrappy as Grindhouse gets. Sets were recycled from Hogan's Heroes after the TV series wrapped, giving it an eerie mix of parody and horror. Thorne's commanding performance turned Ilsa into an icon of exploitation cinema. She was larger than life, unforgettable, and terrifying in every frame. Critics dismissed it as garbage, governments banned it, but the movie survived because audiences wanted something they couldn't get anywhere else. It spawned sequels like Ilsa, Harem Keeper of the Oil Sheiks, each one doubling down on shock value. Ilsa was proof that Grindhouse cinema's power didn't come from polish or prestige, it came from pushing every button, no matter how many censors tried to stop it. It's messy, outrageous, and infamous, and that's why it stands tall as one of the classics that sneered right back at authority. The Last House on the Left, 1972. When Wes Craven made The Last House on the Left, he wasn't trying to create safe entertainment, he was trying to punch audiences in the gut. Released in 1972, this grim tale followed two teenage girls who are kidnapped by a group of criminals on their way to a rock concert. What begins as a standard crime setup spirals into brutality, and by the time the story shifts to revenge, the audience has been dragged through raw cinematic dirt. The movie was marketed with the unforgettable tagline, "To avoid fainting, keep repeating. It's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie." That line alone set the tone. Craven and producer Sean Cunningham wanted viewers to feel like they were trapped in something dangerous and unfiltered. Critics reacted with disgust. Some theaters banned it outright, while others hacked out entire scenes to make it more acceptable. Yet, for Grindhouse fans, that reputation was the exact selling point. They wanted something so raw it felt wrong to watch, and Craven delivered. What makes Last House so unsettling is the collision between cruelty and suburban normality. When the parents of one victim discover the truth, their vengeance is as ruthless as anything the criminals did. Suddenly, violence isn't just the domain of the villains, it consumes the ordinary too. That moral ambiguity rattled people in ways polished Hollywood thrillers never could. The Last House on the Left became a defining moment for American Grindhouse, proving you could make audiences recoil, argue, and even protest, and still keep them coming back for more. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Few titles carry the raw terror of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Released in 1974, Tobe Hooper's nightmare of cannibal families and a chainsaw-wielding killer became one of the most notorious Grindhouse films ever made. It wasn't expensive, it wasn't polished, and yet it crawled under the skin of every viewer who dared to sit through it. Hooper shot it in brutal Texas heat, with actors forced into 12-hour days inside rotting, bone-filled houses. That misery seeped into the film, giving it a documentary-like grit that made audiences question if what they were watching might be real. The dinner scene, where the victims are tied and mocked by the cannibal family, remains one of the most unbearable sequences in horror history. What's wild is how bloodless the movie actually is. The reputation says otherwise, but the horror comes from suggestion, sound design, and claustrophobic tension. It was banned in several countries and censored heavily in others, yet people still lined up at Grindhouse theaters because the word of mouth was explosive. Leatherface became a new kind of movie monster. Not elegant like Dracula or supernatural like Frankenstein, but sweaty, brutal, and terrifyingly human. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre wasn't just shocking, it was groundbreaking. It proved that horror didn't need big budgets or stars, just raw nerve and a willingness to drag audiences into a nightmare. Miss 45, 1981. Abel Ferrara's Miss 45 is the kind of movie that could only come out of New York's Grindhouse heyday. Released in 1981, it tells the story of Thana, a mute seamstress who, after a day of brutal encounters, decides she's done being anyone's victim. Armed with a .45 pistol, she takes to the streets, hunting down predatory men and leaving a trail of bodies behind. What makes Miss 45 powerful isn't just its violence, but the way it flips expectations. Instead of a faceless killer, we get a protagonist who evolves into something far more complicated. Played by Zoe Lund, Thana never speaks a word, yet her eyes carry more rage and despair than pages of dialogue ever could. Ferrara shot New York City as a concrete jungle, grimy and unforgiving. Every street corner, every dark alley feels like it's swallowing people whole. As Thana's campaign escalates, the movie raises uncomfortable questions. When does revenge stop being justice? How long before the line between victim and aggressor blurs completely? The finale, set at a Halloween party where Thana dresses as a nun before unleashing her vengeance, is unforgettable. Both shocking and thematically rich, it left Grindhouse audiences stunned. Critics, of course, dismissed it as exploitation trash, but Ferrara had more on his mind than simple shock value. Miss 45 is one of the rare Grindhouse films that delivers both raw thrills and haunting commentary. It's the kind of movie that sticks with you, not because it's polished, but because it refuses to be ignored. Switchblade Sisters, 1975. Grindhouse didn't just thrive on gore, it thrived on rebellion. Switchblade Sisters, released in 1975, is a perfect example. It tells the story of a teenage girl gang called the Dagger Debs, who fight, betray, and claw their way through an urban jungle of corruption and chaos. Director Jack Hill, already known for blaxploitation hits like Coffee and Foxy Brown, gave this film the same gritty energy but funneled it into a story about young women refusing to play by the rules. The characters are wild, the dialogue is sharp, and the action is gloriously over the top. We're talking fistfights, betrayals, prison breaks, and of course, switchblades flashing in the dark. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Was it satire? Was it serious? In true Grindhouse style, it was both and neither. That confusion made it unforgettable. Audiences didn't line up because it was subtle, they lined up because it was raw, chaotic, and unapologetically in your face. Pam Grier's earlier films paved the way for stories like this, but Switchblade Sisters gave the formula a teenage gang twist that kept it fresh. It didn't make much money at first, but later became a cult favorite, praised by filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino for its fearless energy. Switchblade Sisters is pure Grindhouse chaos, low-budget loud, and impossible to ignore. It's proof that you don't need polish when you've got attitude sharp enough to cut through steel. Rolling Thunder, 1977. Rolling Thunder is what happens when a studio film is too raw for mainstream release. Written by Paul Schrader and directed by John Flynn, this 1977 revenge thriller tells the story of Major Charles Rain, a Vietnam veteran who comes home to a hero's welcome, only to lose everything when a gang brutally murders his family. What follows is one of the most unflinching tales of vengeance ever put on screen. Played by William Devane, Ronnie is a man hollowed out by war who finds new purpose in calculated, merciless revenge. Alongside him is Tommy Lee Jones in one of his early breakout roles as another vet who joins the bloody crusade. Together, they turn grief into violence in a way that left audiences shaken. The movie is brutal but methodical. It doesn't glorify violence. It lets you feel the weight of it. The finale, a shootout in a brothel, is staged like a slow-motion descent into hell. It's sweaty, tense, and unforgettable. 20th Century Fox originally backed the movie, but quickly realized they had something too extreme on their hands. The studio pulled support, and Rolling Thunder found its audience in Grindhouse theaters, where its unflinching tone fit perfectly. Critics were divided. Some praised its honesty. Others condemned its savagery. But for Grindhouse fans, it became a classic example of cinema telling the censors exactly where to shove it. It wasn't just violent, it was fearless. Coffee, 1973. If Grindhouse had a queen, her name was Pam Grier, and Coffee was the movie that crowned her. Released in 1973, this blaxploitation powerhouse gave audiences a vigilante nurse who declared war on pimps, dealers, and corrupt officials. Pam didn't just play Coffee, she embodied her. Every frame radiated power, charisma, and a refusal to bow down to anyone. The story is pure pulp. After her sister falls victim to drug pushers, Coffee takes justice into her own hands. But instead of quietly plotting revenge, she storms through the underworld with fury, using guns, fists, and sheer attitude to dismantle an empire of crime. Director Jack Hill kept the pacing fast and the tone sharp, letting Grier's energy carry the movie like a live wire. What really shook critics wasn't just the violence, but the way Coffee flipped power dynamics. At a time when women of color were pushed to the background in Hollywood, here was Pam Grier, front and center, dominant, decisive, and unrelenting. Grindhouse audiences cheered, while censors bristled at the sheer audacity. Coffee wasn't subtle. It wasn't supposed to be. It was a street-level grenade that blew the doors open for an entire wave of films where women weren't just side characters. They were the main event. By the time the credits rolled, Coffee had proven something the censors hated to admit. Audiences loved a hero who didn't care about rules, only results. The Big Bird Cage, 1972. Before Hollywood figured out how to polish the women in prison genre into glossy thrillers, Grindhouse theaters were showing raw, unapologetic stories like The Big Bird Cage. Released in 1972, this Jack Hill-directed gem teamed Pam Grier and Sid Haig in a tale of rebellion, captivity, and chaos that delighted Grindhouse crowds. The setup is outrageous. A group of women is forced into hard labor at a brutal camp, watched over by guards who enjoy cruelty a little too much. Enter Pam Grier as Blossom, a force of nature who teams up with Haig's revolutionary character to spark a riot that turns the entire camp upside down. What makes The Big Bird Cage memorable is its gleeful excess. The prison is less about realism and more about being a stage for rebellion. Every scene is designed to shock, excite, or amuse. The fights are wild, the dialogue is sharp, and the pacing never lets up. Censors hated it, calling it crude and exploitative, but audiences saw something different, a story where women fought back instead of quietly enduring. Pam Grier's presence elevated everything. She wasn't just playing a role, she was redefining what a Grindhouse heroine could be. Tough, stylish, and impossible to forget. The Big Bird Cage wasn't refined cinema, but it didn't need to be. It was loud, raw, and completely unashamed, which made it exactly what Grindhouse was all about. Last House on Dead End Street, 1977. Now, we arrive at one of Grindhouse's most infamous underground legends, Last House on Dead End Street. Released in 1977 with little fanfare, this movie carried the reputation of being so disturbing that it was whispered about more than it was actually seen. The story follows a disgruntled ex-con who decides to make his mark by producing underground films with a difference. Real violence. He lures in desperate participants and creates a series of increasingly brutal snuff-style productions. Even though it was fictional, the movie blurred the line between performance and reality in ways that deeply unsettled viewers. Shot on a tiny budget with unknown actors, the film had a raw, grainy look that made it feel almost like a documentary. That visual grit convinced some audiences that they were watching something they weren't supposed to. Stories spread that it was a genuine snuff film, which only added to its mystique. Censors loathed it, critics buried it, and distributors barely touched it. But in Grindhouse circles, that reputation only fueled curiosity. Bootleg copies circulated, each one making the legend bigger. Today, it stands as one of the most infamous lost Grindhouse films, a title so daring, so taboo, that it could only survive underground. Last House on Dead End Street showed how far Grindhouse cinema could push, not just in gore, but in daring audiences to question the very nature of what they were watching. The Toolbox Murders, 1978. If you want to see how Grindhouse could turn something ordinary into nightmare fuel, look no further than The Toolbox Murders. Released in 1978, this slasher exploitation flick took everyday tools, wrenches, drills, hammers, and turned them into instruments of terror. The plot follows a masked killer stalking an apartment complex, using his toolbox to carry out a series of grisly murders. It's straightforward, but the execution is where the shock value hit. Watching a drill press against a victim's skin or a hammer raised with cruel intent made audiences squirm in their seats. The movie was so explicit in its violence that many theaters refused to screen it. Critics blasted it as cheap exploitation, but Grindhouse audiences saw it differently. They didn't expect polished storytelling, they came for the raw, visceral impact, and Toolbox delivered that in spades. Adding to its Grindhouse charm was the way it blurred into social commentary. Beneath the gore, it hinted at suburban repression, loneliness, and obsession boiling under the surface of everyday life. But make no mistake, this was primarily about shock, and it didn't apologize for it. The Toolbox Murders later inspired remakes and homages, proving that even the most derided Grindhouse entries could leave a lasting mark. It wasn't Hollywood's kind of horror, it was too raw, too direct, and far too willing to make censors wince. That's exactly why it belongs on this list. Don't Go in the House, 1979. Closing out the list is Don't Go in the House, a 1979 psychological horror that pushed Grindhouse into deeply disturbing territory. The film tells the story of Donnie, a socially isolated man raised under the cruel hand of his mother. When she dies, instead of freedom, Donnie spirals into madness. He kidnaps women and subjects them to terrifying fates inside his fire-damaged home. Unlike some Grindhouse films that leaned on chaos and absurdity, Don't Go in the House built its horror slowly. The house itself felt like a character, dark, burned, and suffocating. Donnie's unraveling mind was captured in long, tense sequences that dragged audiences into his disturbed world. Censors loathed it, labeling it obscene and cutting scenes that they deemed too much for audiences. That only made it more appealing to Grindhouse fans who wanted something raw and unsettling. The movie didn't hide behind glossy effects or big stars. It embraced its low-budget grit and created something unforgettable. What makes it stand out is the psychological depth. Instead of a faceless killer, we got a portrait of madness shaped by trauma and isolation. It wasn't an easy watch, but Grindhouse wasn't built for comfort. It was built to challenge, disturb, and provoke. Don't Go in the House did exactly that, cementing itself as one of the boldest Grindhouse films to tell the censors, in no uncertain terms, to shove it. And there you have it, 15 Grindhouse classics that didn't just push boundaries, they bulldozed them. These weren't movies made for approval, they were movies made to shock, thrill, and stick in your brain long after the credits rolled. Which of these rebellious classics is your favorite? Or did we miss one that deserves a spot? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and keep the Grindhouse spirit alive. After all, the best cinema isn't always polite. It's the kind that refuses to play by the rules.